Hi all, welcome back. Last time out we talked just endocrine system in general, talking about the differences basically between hormones and nerves and the different types of hormones, whether they be fat-based or protein-based. Okay, this time out we're going to talk about specific glands and regions that will excrete hormones, and we'll talk about kind of the purposes of those hormones, what they might control, kind of factors that might be associated with that hormone. Okay, the pituitary gland is really one of those major organs or regions of the body that produce hormones or are associated with hormones. Okay, so it lies right at the base of the brain, okay, in a specialized kind of indentation called the coelentera in the sphenoid bone. And the interesting thing about the pituitary gland is it has two main regions, an anterior region and a posterior region. So one that's towards the front of the head and then the one that's behind it. So it's split kind of in two. And the kind of interesting thing about that is part of it is controlled by hormones and the other part is controlled by nerves. Right? And so two lobes, the anterior lobe, the more front facing lobe, and the posterior lobe. Okay, so the anterior is called the adenohypophyse. Okay, the adeno part should give away what kind of material this is associated with. This is associated with hormones. The neurohypophyse is associated with neurons. Okay, so the anterior lobe is controlled by hormones and the posterior lobe is controlled by neurons. Okay. So different methods, they're both associated with the hypothalamus. Okay, and we'll look here at a cross section so I can show you where that's at. Okay, and the hypothalamus is controlling both, but in different ways. One with hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, and one that are nerve impulses that are coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, you also have this small intermediate kind of lobe called the pars intermedia. Okay, that controls the production of melanin. Okay, so remember the purpose of melanin is to protect the body from UV radiation. It's what causes darker pigments to happen in hair and skin, eyes, etc. Because melanin, that darker pigment, helps it control UV and not allow UV rays to damage DNA. All right, looking at the cross section. Okay, so if you look at the cross section at the base of the brain, you're going to see the pituitary gland. Again, two lobes, anterior lobe, posterior lobe. Okay, above it is the hypothalamus. Okay. And so you would see blood connection, and I'll show you a photo of this, blood connection to the anterior from the hypothalamus and neural connection to the posterior from the hypothalamus. Okay. Another region right above the pituitary gland, which is important probably for a lot of the stimulation of the hypothalamus, is the optic nerve. Okay, and so that region right there is actually called the optic chiasma, and that's where the optic nerves come in and cross. And we talked about this when we were talking about how your eyes work. Remember that you have optic nerves coming from your eyes, they cross, and then that allows for binocular vision, that allows for images to kind of be flipped and for us to see more of a 3D world because we're creating one image. That's kind of part of that magic or part of that great ability for us to do has to come from that optic chiasma. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about the anterior lobe regulation. Again, it's connected by hypophyseal portal veins. Okay, so there's veins that are coming from the hypothalamus into the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So it's going to have these releasing hormones, the hypothalamic or the hypothalamus releasing hormones, or inhibiting hormones. Okay, so it can release stimulating hormones or inhibiting hormones. Okay, and that's going to travel via a vein connection to the anterior region. Okay. That will stimulate the anterior lobe to release its own hormones. And those hormones can travel to lots of different places. One of the main places they might travel to is the thyroid. Okay? And we'll look at specifics behind that here in a little bit. Okay? The pituitary lobe, on the other hand, it's stimulated by neurons that are in the hypothalamus. So they're hypothalamal neurons that travel from the hypothalamus and embed themselves in the posterior lobe. Okay, and that will release hormones. And then remember, all hormones travel in blood. Okay, so those hormones would be released, picked up by blood, and travel to different regions, okay, of the body. All right, so just looking at this real quick. So you have these hypothalamic neurons. Hey, so all of them are going to be stimulated because the stimulation, it's controlled by neurons. So it's going to be controlled by something that stimulates these neurons. That could be vision, could be smell, could be touch, could be potentially food. There's lots of things that can stimulate these neurons. These neurons then stimulate the release of some hormones. Those hormones make it into the blood, travel from the blood into the anterior region. This is going to stimulate more hormone production, and then those hormones can travel out. Okay? In this case, the posterior region, okay, there's no blood connection between the hypothalamic region and the posterior, but there is a neuron connection. Okay, so the axons run all the way through, stimulate the production of hormones in the posterior. They travel into the blood and then can travel through the blood to different regions of the body. Okay, so 3 kind of step pathway. Again, you got to have a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. It can be inhibiting or it can be stimulating. And that's going to travel to the pituitary gland. Either if we're talking about 3-step ways, we're talking about the anterior region because the hormone is going to be traveling, okay, from the hypothalamus into the pituitary gland. If we're talking about a 3-step pathway that doesn't involve a hormone in the first part of the pathway, and instead it's neurons, okay, then that hormone is not going to be stimulated in the hypothalamus, but rather the neuron would be stimulated. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases a hormone, it travels via blood to the anterior pituitary. Okay, that interaction, that hormone is going to entice new hormones to be made. So we could call this hormone 1, hormone 2, okay? And then hormone 2 is going to travel to a peripheral endocrine gland. Could be the thyroid, could be the adrenal gland, lots of things. Okay? That's going to secrete another hormone, and that's going to travel to the target cell. Now, interestingly and importantly, along these pathways, you can have what we call negative feedback. Remember, we talked about this back when we were talking about homeostasis. Negative feedback is going to prevent the overproduction of material, so wasted energy. So you're producing too much releasing hormone, then some of the hormones from the peripheral endocrine gland secretion, that might fit back in and stop this from occurring. Okay, so it inhibits or controls and tries to balance or make the system more balanced, so in a homeostatic state. Okay, so let's look at it. Hypothalamus is producing a hormone, we'll call it hormone 1, releases it, travels via blood to the anterior pituitary. Okay, that entices hormone 2 to be produced. That travels to, let's just say, the thyroid. The thyroid then produces a hormone that travels to the target. That hormone is, if there's a bunch in solution, okay, it can travel back into the anterior or the hypothalamus and shut it down. You could also have the hormone, like hormone 2, that's created from the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, it could fit back in and shut it down. Okay, so lots of ways that can stop the process from happening. Okay, if there's too much, or if there's um, a side effect that might not be what's expected, this kind of thing can shut this down. There's lots of other ways that this can malfunction. We'll talk about some of them as we progress. Okay, so let's look at a few pituitary hormones, specific hormones. Okay, so again, it's normally a hormone per cell type kind of secretion. So there are secretory cells that release specific types of hormones. Remember, hormones can be fats or proteins. Okay, these cells, their job is to generate that material, that hormone. Okay, and so really each cell kind of can generate one-ish types of hormones. But you can stimulate multiple cells at the same time. So you could have multiple hormones being secreted at the same time. So these cells are going to excrete hormones. Those hormones are going to travel in the blood and travel to different regions. The major ones that we're going to talk about are these. You have growth hormones, and we'll come back and talk about what they do, but you should be able to figure that out. Growth. Okay, prolactin. This is a hormone for mammary gland secretion, so increase in milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone, the adrenal corticotropic hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormones. A lot of these have to do with reproduction, okay, either stimulating the production of sperm, egg follicles, stimulating the mammary glands, okay, and then many of them are stimulating growth of the body, whether that be growth of muscle, bone, adipose tissue, etc. Okay. All right. So again, the hormones from the hypothalamus, okay, are going to entice hormones from the pituitary gland to travel to different regions. Okay. Sometimes they act directly on the material. Sometimes they have to act on another gland, and then that would release other hormones from those glands. But lots of ways at which this can happen. Okay, just generalized kind of growth. So adding new tissue, bone, muscle, adipose, stimulating milk, shutting off milk. Okay, stimulating things that have to do with the thyroid gland, which we'll come back and talk specific about the thyroid, stimulating things that have to do with the adrenal gland, this top of the kidney, and things that are associated with that. We'll come back and talk about that. Stimulating things that have to do directly with reproduction, whether that be testes or ovaries, and we'll come back and talk about these. All right, so growth hormone in general. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you remember back from maybe a earlier biology class, cells have to go through a cycle, okay, called the cell cycle, and that determines if the cell is ready or going to divide. Okay, and then when it's determined, hey, the cell is large enough, it can divide, then it starts to go through the division. Okay, growth hormones will stimulate that to occur, stimulate that cell to multiply, go through mitosis or go through meiosis and multiply. Okay? It also can stimulate other things like the production of extra protein, the usage of carbohydrates, whether or not be to conserve carbohydrates. So if you're conserving carbohydrates, you're going to increase the amount of fat potentially in some situations, or decrease depending on whether you're building bone and muscle or you're increasing fat production, etc. So there's lots of ways in which the growth hormones work, okay, and we'll look at some more specifics on that later. Prolactin, okay, milk production in females, we're not really sure what it does in males, but they still do produce some prolactin, and so it could just be a hormone that's produced but has little to no function. And other things, thyroid stimulating hormones. Okay, we'll come back and look at the thyroid gland. Okay, adrenal corticotropic hormone, or the ACTHs. Okay, that stimulates cortisol being released from the adrenal cortex. Come back and look at the function of that. Follicle stimulating. Okay, luteinizing hormone. Okay, both sex hormones for males and females. Okay, and we'll dive into some of these in much greater detail. Okay, so the pathway from the thyroid hormone. Okay, so now let's say the hypothalamus is stimulated the pituitary has stimulated the thyroid. Okay, so now that pathway would look something like this. The hormone that is released from the hypothalamus is the thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH. Okay, the thyroid releasing hormone then travels to the pituitary gland. Okay, because it's a hormone, it's traveling to the anterior part of it, and that secretes the thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, that travels to the thyroid gland, and it causes the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormones. Okay, those thyroid hormones would then go to target cells and entice the target cells to do whatever the specific hormone is going to entice. Okay, of course, you have negative feedbacks both at the TRH and the TSH sides of it, so that can stop that action that's happening in the thyroid gland. Okay, so two main control methods for this pathway. So you have thyroid secreting hormone, okay, and that's controlled by how much thyroid releasing hormone is. That should make sense, right? If you have lots of thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then you probably have lots of thyroid secreting hormone. Okay? The other thing is it can be controlled by a negative feedback from the thyroid hormones. You produce a bunch of these hormones in the thyroid, it can fit back in at the pituitary gland and stop the production of TSH. Okay, this is what it kind of would look like from a negative feedback loop. Okay, so thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus entices thyroid stimulating hormone to be produced, travels in the bloodstream to the thyroid gland. Okay, action from the thyroid gland, it's going to produce thyroid hormone back into the blood to the target cells. Too much of it travels back to the pituitary gland or the hypothalamus and shuts different regions of this down. Okay, that is how we create homeostasis within the body, okay, to not overproduce thyroid releasing hormone or overproduce thyroid stimulating hormone, and control this kind of pathway. All right, let's look at what happens when you don't have control. Okay, kind of an example of this growth hormone inability to control it. Okay, so you have hypopituitary dwarfism or hypopituitary dwarfism. Okay, so this is the result of deficiency in human growth hormone. Okay, so that human growth hormone, one of those hormones that the anterior pituitary gland is going to be releasing. Remember, it's stimulating muscle production, it's stimulating bone growth, it's stimulating fat usage. Okay, and if you don't have enough of it, you typically become very short in stature. Your body portions and everything might be normal, okay, we're just talking that you're not getting enough growth hormone, so your bones don't grow fast enough, your muscles don't grow fast enough, okay? And so you have very short stature. Okay. You can be treated with human growth hormone if you have a deficiency. Normally this has to do with the pituitary gland not functioning correctly. Could be the hypothalamus not releasing a stimulant, but normally it's the pituitary gland is not producing the growth hormones it should. And so you could be treated with this as long as the bones have not ossified. So if it's caught really young in an individual's life, maybe definitely before the age of 5, then it is possible that you could play catch up a little bit and stimulate growth so the individual is not extremely small in stature. The opposite can be true. Okay, so you can have over excretion of human growth hormone or growth hormone during your childhood. Normally this is due to a tumor on the pituitary gland, okay, and it just continuously excretes growth hormone, and so the feedback loop doesn't work. There's no shutting it off, and the individual has extreme height like this gentleman here that's pictured here. Okay. And then acromegaly, this is when you have similar over secretion of growth hormone, but you have it as an adult. So after the epithelial ossification, so remember, after your growth plates have already solidified, and so you're not adding new bone growth, if this occurs, then the bones just thicken. Okay, and other regions will just thicken. Your muscles will thicken, your bones will thicken, regions will become enlarged, so much that often you have complications with potentially breathing, eating, lots of things that can happen due to the enlargement of different regions of the body. Okay. This also is normally associated with a tumor that happens in the pituitary gland, but a tumor that might happen later in life after epithelial plate fusion. All right, let's look at the posterior pituitary hormones. So real quick, again, these ones are released by stimulation of neurons that are coming from the hypothalamus. All right. Two main ones, ADH and oxytocin. Okay, ADH is going to stimulate vasoconstriction, and oxytocin can also do that. These two hormones are very similar to each other, but may have different functions in different situations and different body regions. Okay, again though, these are produced in the posterior region of the pituitary gland due to nerve impulses that are coming from the hypothalamus. Okay, so let's look at those two. So antidiuretic, okay, this is going to cause a few different things. First, vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure, but it also decreases urine production. So it withholds liquid in the body. Okay, so it reduces how much water the kidneys are excreting. Okay, can be very important for things like regions where maybe you're starting to become dehydrated. Okay, this kicks in, the ADH kicks in, and increases your blood pressure. Okay, but also causes less water to be absorbed and excreted out, and so more water to be conserved. Okay. Oxytocin, all right, same kind of thing in many situations. It's increasing blood pressure. All right. But we talked about this many lectures ago. Oxytocin is directly related to uterine wall contractions. Okay, this is the result often of the head of the fetus pushing on the walls of the uterine walls, which stimulates the nerve impulse that travels to the brain, stimulates the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce oxytocin. Okay, and this oxytocin then stimulates the walls to start contracting, okay, in order to force the offspring out of the womb. Okay, it also causes milk ejection during lactation. Okay, so quite a few different functions in females. Many of the functions in males are really not known well, but some might have to do with things that are associated with male sex organs, like sperm movement or sexual response of males in regard to